For the main event, we have three titans of trust with us here this morning, beginning with Alexia Smokler. Alexia is NAR's Senior Policy Representative for Fair Housing. Alexia served as project manager for the development of fair housing simulation that I cannot wait for us to tour, Fairhaven. She also contributes to the development of NAR's fair housing regulated legislative and regulatory policy priorities, and she develops fair housing resources and training for members, associations, and brokerages. Alexia will be followed by our very own Michele McCaskill. Michele is the Vice President of Risk Management and Assistant General Counsel for Canopy Realtor Association and Canopy MLS. She has worked at the association for an astounding 25 years, serving in various capacities, all while earning her law degree in 2011. As VP of Risk Management, Michele reviews association contracts, policy, and bylaws, administers the realtor mediation process, ethics and arbitration services, and serves as staff liaison for the grievance and professional standards committees. Rounding out the speakers this morning is the priceless gem herself, Debbie Way. Debbie is the Vice President of MLS Administration. She is a nationally recognized MLS professional with a reputation for knowledge and expertise with MLS policy and often writes articles and speaks, wait for it, at your office sales meeting, hint, hint, about important topics such as the Canopy MLS rules and regulations, as well as compliance within the MLS system. She is also responsible for ensuring the delivery of MLS support, compliance administration, training, and data licensing. Ladies, thank you so much for being here this morning. We are looking forward to a great program. And Alexia, I am on the edge of my seat waiting for you. Good morning to you.
Good morning, David. How are you today?
We're doing good.
And good morning to the brokers in charge of the Canopy Realtor Association. I want to thank Karen Lindsay for inviting me to speak with you today. My name is Alexia Smokler, and I'm the Senior Policy Representative for Fair Housing at NAR. My position is new. NAR has created 3 new fair housing positions over the last 18 months. We're making fair housing a priority, and you're going to be hearing a lot more from us in the coming months on fair housing. So I'm here to be your fair housing resource at your National Association, and I encourage any of you to reach out to me with your fair housing questions and ideas. I'm putting my email there in the chat box. And please watch the chat box because I'll be posting links throughout my presentation. Today, I'm going to talk to you about what we've been working on over the past year at NAR on fair housing. And then I'm going to take you on a little tour of Fairhaven, our new fair housing training. So first, a little bit of background. A little over a year ago, NAR created a new Fair Housing Policy Committee of member volunteers, and it created a new Director of Fair Housing Policy. NAR hired Brian Green for that role. Brian, my former boss at HUD, previously led fair housing enforcement at HUD. He is one of the most knowledgeable and committed people out there when it comes to fair housing. He is a great asset to NAR and to all of us. 3 weeks into Brian's tenure, in December of 2019, the industry was rocked by the Newsday investigation of discrimination by real estate agents on Long Island. If you're not familiar, Newsday was a 3-year study using matched pair testing to look at how the top brokerages on Long Island treated clients of different backgrounds. I expect most of you are familiar with discrimination testing. There are 2 testers posing as clients. They both have the same qualifications. They're even dressed the same. And they're looking for the same kind of house. The only difference between them is their race, national origin, or other prohibited basis for discrimination. They each go into a brokerage to see what kind of treatment they receive, and that treatment is compared. Courts consider testing evidence to be some of the most persuasive evidence a plaintiff in a discrimination case can bring. After its 3-year study, Newsday didn't take its findings to court. They published them. And what they caught on hidden camera was that real estate agents treated the 2 testers differently in 40% of the interactions, almost half the time for Black testers. Agents showed the minority tester fewer listings. They steered them to different neighborhoods based on their race or national origin. They required some to be pre-approved to go out and see listings, and they didn't require others based on their race. They told them different things about crime and schools. They quite clearly did not provide equal professional service. So I would encourage you, if you haven't watched the documentary yet with all of the hidden camera footage, to check it out. It's eye-opening. After that investigation was published, and by the way, I just posted a link in the chat box. After that investigation was published, the New York State Legislature launched hearings, subpoenaed agents and brokers, and earlier this year, a whole raft of new legislation was introduced in New York to combat real estate discrimination. So at NAR, 3 weeks after Brian joined the team in the new fair housing role, Newsday kicked everything fair housing into high gear. We launched our ACT Fair Housing Initiative. ACT stands for Accountability, Culture Change, and Training. It's a comprehensive effort. Part of it is to make sure we hold real estate professionals accountable when they violate fair housing laws. But also, we want to shift hearts and minds so that equal service is something that is woven into the way we serve consumers and the public. And so that when we say realtors hold themselves to a high ethical standard, upholding fair housing is core to that. What we're telling realtors is that yes, fair housing is the law. Yes, it is the ethical thing to do. But what's more, making homeownership available to the broadest possible group of qualified buyers is good for your business. It's good for your community. It's good for our economy. Nationwide, homeownership growth over the last 10 years has been driven by Hispanic Americans. Some data there linked in the chat box. There are millions of qualified, mortgage-ready Black and Hispanic millennials who are ready and able to purchase a home. That market isn't being fully served. The racial homeownership gap, a 30-point gap between Blacks and whites, it's the same as it was in 1968, the year the Fair Housing Act was passed. So what happens when we do nothing? What happens if we allow discrimination and segregation to continue? Well, it's really important and for you to understand and take away from my discussion today that housing discrimination isn't something that just hurts other people or disadvantaged groups. It hurts us all. Morgan Stanley recently came out with a study showing that discrimination stopped 5 million qualified buyers from owning homes, cost nearly 800,000 jobs, and $400 billion in tax revenue. There's a link to that study. Another recent study found that in the Chicago metro area alone, housing discrimination and housing segregation is costing that economy $8 billion a year. Why? Because when some people can't access the intergenerational wealth that comes from home ownership, when segregation keeps people from living near good jobs, when kids can't access good schools and the resources they need to become productive citizens, all that potential is lost. The entire economy is held back. It's artificially constrained. The size of the pie is decreased for all of us. So let's talk about what NAR is doing to advance home ownership in the neighborhood of choice for all qualified buyers, regardless of their background or identity. ACT is an acronym. The A stands for accountability. NAR is creating a program for brokerages who want to voluntarily test themselves for discrimination. This will allow them to uncover and address problems before a newspaper or a private fair housing group uncovers them. We're creating a methodology and infrastructure that will allow interested brokerages to raise their hand, say they want to do it, and then plug and play. They'll be tested, receive a confidential report of the findings, and then have access to training and other remediation measures to correct whatever problems, if any, are uncovered. And I want to note that in Newsday, 12 brokerages were tested, the 12 largest brokerages on Long Island. There were findings against 10, but 2 of them had no findings. They were doing something right. Also on the accountability front, we're engaged in a review of the licensure laws of all 50 states. We're looking at enforcement of fair housing violations, and we're also looking at fair housing education requirements. And we'll be working with AEs in those states who want to make those laws stronger. The next 2 prongs of ACT, C for culture change and T for training, are interwoven. We're very excited about a video series we're about to launch of Realtor fair housing champions who embrace fair housing as part of their business strategy. And we're going to be finding additional ways to acknowledge Realtors who are fair housing leaders to help shift the culture of our industry to one that applauds and celebrates fair housing. We're also introducing new and innovative training opportunities for Realtors. In June, we released a 50-minute training video on implicit bias in real estate, which is available on our website. There's the link. Oops. Hang on a second here. There we go. Implicit bias is the way that our brains automatically and often without our conscious awareness associate stereotypes with people who are different from us. So that even as our conscious minds reject discrimination, and even as we hold up fairness and equal treatment as our cherished values, our unconscious minds may be causing us to treat people differently or unfairly without our even intending to. This training offers practical tools customized for the real estate context to help us identify and overcome these hidden biases so we can treat all customers fairly. Following up on that video, we're launching a 3-hour classroom course on implicit bias that goes even deeper with more exercises and more tools to help us check our own biases. We're getting ready to pilot that training in 3 states where we expect it will be offered for CE credit. And then back in November, we launched Fairhaven, a fair housing simulation. Fairhaven is a new approach to fair housing training. There isn't anything else like it. We decided to create Fairhaven not long after the Newsday investigation was published. We saw in one of those videos, an agent referenced his fair housing training. He talked about steering, and he said he wasn't supposed to do it. And then he did it. Something wasn't connecting. We could see that we need a new kind of fair housing training, one that teaches not only the substance of fair housing law, but would also move more agents to fully understand and embrace it. So Fairhaven is not your traditional lecture and quiz. It's a simulation experience. It uses storytelling to affect the learner's emotions. The scenarios in Fairhaven are based on real fair housing cases and on our conversations with members. So let's take a look. Just give me one moment here while I get my screen set up to share. So you access Fairhaven at fairhaven.realtor. Anyone with a NERDS ID can access. We also have Fairhaven available as a software package for brokerages to load onto their own learning management system. Oops. When learners launch the course, they'll see a 2-minute video setting up the stakes and introducing them to this town of Fairhaven and their role in the simulation. So let's just take 2 minutes to watch this intro video.
Welcome to Fairhaven. From our rapidly expanding downtown area to our thriving suburban neighborhoods, our magnetic metropolis attracts new businesses, tourists, and of course, new residents. As a potential home buyer, you'll get to explore our vibrant neighborhoods. No matter what you're looking for, there's a place and a price point that fits your wants and needs. As a real estate agent in Fairhaven, you get to help prospective buyers find their ideal house, townhome, or apartment. Your task in this simulation is to sell 4 homes within 6 months while adhering to fair housing principles. This is your opportunity to grow your reputation in the community and build a business that champions inclusiveness and diversity. Here in Fairhaven, we're committed to doing our part to ensure buyers, sellers, and agents are treated fairly, but there's still a lot of work to do. Join our journey and help us make Fairhaven a thriving, inclusive community.
So as mentioned in the video, learners in the fictional town of Fairhaven take the role of an agent, and the goal is to sell 4 homes in 6 months. I hope you're noticing this beautiful design. Fairhaven has a very modern look and feel. It's a really lovely place, except that there's a whole lot of housing discrimination going on. As learners make their way through the scenarios trying to sell homes, they will confront different kinds of discrimination. In most scenarios, learners will have the opportunity to make a sale if their choices align with fair housing principles. If the learner is not making the correct choices, he or she will get fed more scenarios and have more opportunities to practice and more opportunities to make that sale. This means that the course can take from 60 to 100 minutes to complete, depending on the learner's performance. They'll receive feedback and resources along the way, and at the end, they'll receive a report summarizing their performance. Here's the user interface. This shows learners how many transactions they've closed, how much time they have left. That's where you can send me an email if you have any questions. In our first scenario here, let me just pause for a second. This is our first scenario. In this scenario, our client is Carl Robinson. He's a qualified buyer who wants to buy a very large house. In this scenario, which is based on a real fair housing case, the seller backed out of the agreement after learning the buyer was Black. As the learner makes their way through the simulation, they'll make decisions as they interact with clients and colleagues. Here, the learner has to decide how to advise Mr. Robinson in the face of discrimination. In this scenario, I just made choices that did not get the sale. Mr. Robinson works with a competing brokerage, and they help him buy his waterfront mansion. We see a variety of fair housing scenarios in Fairhaven. In this scenario, I'm working with a client who uses a wheelchair. He needs a modification to access the condo building lobby. So here I've just made choices to help my client work with the condo board to get the ramp he needs to access the building. In the process, I've also educated the condo board on their fair housing responsibilities. And I get a sale. You can see here that I can click out to get additional resources if I want to go deeper. Oops. Oh goodness. There we go. I'm going to show you one more scenario. This scenario shows a unique aspect of Fairhaven. So sometimes in Fairhaven, we flip the script. You're not playing a role of an agent anymore. You're playing the role of a client. We introduced this perspective shift in order to evoke an emotional reaction that encourages empathy in the learner. In this scenario, you are a member of a gay couple who is not receiving equal professional service from a real estate agent. Throughout the simulation, we replicate conversations, phone calls, emails, and texts that you might engage in with clients and colleagues and other agents. And then as you play through as the client, you're forced to make the choices that a client would have to make when they're being discriminated against. And the idea is to just give you a small sample of what that feels like. In this scenario, you are the client who could not buy the home you wanted and were qualified for because an agent failed to provide you with the same service she provides to other clients. Here again, we click out to additional resources. This one is on working with LGBTQ buyers and sellers. We also pair these client point of view scenarios with video testimonials from real people who are victims of housing discrimination. In this case, it's a gay man talking about being harassed by the manager of his apartment building because of his sexual orientation. I'll stop the demo here and just add a few concluding points. We've had about 5,000 members complete the simulation thus far, and it's gotten consistently high marks from learners. We've had members comment that it opened their eyes to see ways they were behaving that might implicate implicit bias or other ways that they were unfairly treating clients that they hadn't realized before. We had a learner say that he got mad when he was in the position of a client who was being discriminated against. And we've gotten feedback that Fairhaven has motivated members to be more sensitive to clients' concerns and to stand up for their clients in difficult situations. We think it's a great tool and we're really proud of it. And that concludes my presentation. I'll open it up to your questions now.
All right, Alexia, fantastic. Did not disappoint. I actually was jotting
David,
down.
we can't hear you.
How about now? Can you hear me now?
That was me. I had my volume turned down. Sorry.
Okay. All right. So tons of great stuff. And I jotted down so many questions, and your presentation was so concise. You were knocking the questions out of the park. One thing maybe I can extend a little bit on your closing remarks about some of the takeaways that they've had. If we go from the beginning, what were some of the, other than the takeaways, what would those folks that had these aha moments after they did it, what would they say in terms of what's the motivating factor that agents should try this out and actually do this?
I think a lot of them said it opened their eyes, that they weren't aware of things that were going on. And, you know, it was important that, you know, they had this realization that, wow, like I had no idea these sorts of situations happen. But we had other people say, I have encountered this situation and I wasn't sure what to say. And this has now given me some pointers so that I can deal with this situation better next time.
Got it. All right, this is fantastic stuff. Again, we got a quiet gallery, and what that means is you've given us a ton to ponder and actually a very comprehensive report. So stick around. There could be more questions to come, and we don't want you to go anywhere if you can stay with us. And we all do want to say thank you for that. Fairhaven is something I'm really excited about, and I can't wait to try it out. So Alexia is followed by our very own Michele McCaskill, who again is Vice President of Risk Management and Assistant General Counselor for Canopy Realtor Association. Good morning, Michele.
I am going to pull up my PowerPoint presentation. Hopefully I can do this correctly. I've been trained by the best, but you never know. Okay, can everyone see that? Because I cannot see myself at all. So I am just going to begin. I am excited to be here today to cover in broad detail the recent changes to the Code of Ethics, which were approved and went into effect in November of 2020. So my hope today is that I can break down these rather significant changes in a way that will help you understand what this means for you as realtors. So for any of you who have actually watched how this process has played out or paid attention to the many, many comments about these decisions and these changes, you've undoubtedly seen the spectrum of viewpoints about the change. There's a lot of concern about the effects this could have on realtors and their careers. And there's also a lot of misinformation out there. So hopefully this presentation will answer some of those questions you may have, or some of those questions that your agents may bring to you down the road. So with that, I want to give you a roadmap of where I'm headed. I'm going to start with a little bit of background about how these changes were actually initiated, and then jump right into the changes, starting with Policy Statement 29, the actual changes to Article 10, then the expansion of the definition of public trust and modifications to sanctioning guidelines. Okay, I'm getting some texts over here. I have done something wrong. I did not share my screen. That is a problem. Don't you love Zoom. Okay, have I done it correctly? I think I have.
Yes, ma'am. We're seeing.
Okay, sorry about that. I don't know if y'all were just looking at my face or my whatever. Anyways, here I am back. Okay, and jumping back in. I have given you my roadmap, and now we're going to jump right in. So apologize for that. So Article 10 of the Code of Ethics until recently prohibited discrimination based on the protected classes in certain situations and then only if tied to a real estate transaction. Specifically, it prohibited and still does prohibit denying equal professional services to any person based on the 9 protected classes. And remember, in 2014, NAR expanded the protected classes from the 7 that we're all familiar with to adding 2 additional protected classes, that being sexual orientation and gender identity. So we're looking at 9 protected classes when we look at the Code of Ethics. And again, Article 10, in addition to equal professional services, it prohibits realtors from being parties to any plan or agreement to discriminate, and also prohibits discrimination in real estate practices. So due to the increase in social unrest that we started to experience in 2020 and an increasing incidences of hate speech and harassing speech being posted on social media, associations and members approached NAR and asked NAR to look into how the Code of Ethics could apply in these situations. And as a result of that, the National Association's Professional Standards Committee started discussions. And after great exploration, debate, collaboration, came up with these proposed changes to the Code of Ethics, which were approved and went into effect on November 13th of 2020. And the first of those changes was a change that was made to Policy Statement 29. I have just gotten a note that my internet is unstable. Can someone tell me if you can see my presentation?
Hey, Michelle, I can see your presentation. And
I'm getting texts that I can't, so
yeah,
right, I'm good.
The internet is in and out just a little bit, but keep trucking. You are fine. Just keep trucking.
Okay, all right. So going back to Policy Statement 29, which was adopted in February of 1988, this limited the applicability of Article 10 and the code in general to real estate related activities and transactions involving a realtor. The new policy statement is now very short, and it simply reads that a realtor shall be subject to disciplinary action under the Code of Ethics with respect to all of their activities. So this change is significant because it does allow all of the realtor activities to be subject to the code, not just those related to a real estate transaction. So the second change that was made to Article 10 with the addition of Standard of Practice 10.5, which reads that realtors must not use harassing speech, hate speech, epithets, or slurs based on the 9 protected classes. So important to point out is that this is not retroactive. So this does not apply to anything that occurred before November 13th. So for instance, if there was a realtor who posted harassing speech or hate speech on social media on November 12th of 2020, that would not be actionable under the code. However, if another realtor reposted that on November 14th of 2020, that realtor could be found in violation of the code under Article 10. So the actual changes to this article do flow from Article 10's already in place requirement not to deny professional services or be a party to any plan to discriminate. When a realtor posts hate speech or harassing speech on social media or elsewhere, that act in and of itself could reveal a particular bias against one of the protected classes or a potential unwillingness of a realtor to work with a certain agent or individual or not treat them equally. So let's dive a little bit deeper into what this all really means. So a lot of what we're hearing when people comment on this change is that it's overly broad, and anything I say now that someone might consider offensive could be considered a violation of the code. Well, that's not necessarily true. The standard of practice is based on very particular types of speech, and it's connected to very particular protected classes covered under Article 10. It's not based on what I might consider myself to be offensive speech. And again, the speech itself must be targeted at a protected class. So the three best words that I've heard in all of the presentations I've been in that NAR has produced on this subject are content, context, and intent. So when we examine these statements or these actions, we need to be looking at whether the actual, we need to look at what the actual content of what was said was. We need to look at the context in which it was said, and then the intent behind that. So there's very important things to look at when we're examining this language. There is a two-part test that must be applied when we're dealing with this. This is what our grievance committees and our professional standards hearing panels will apply when we're dealing with these types of complaints. So you're not just looking at whether the person making the complaint was offended, or instead looking at it from an objective standpoint and applying the two-part test. The first question being, is the speech harassing speech, hate speech, epithets, or slurs? And then the second question, is it protected? Is it based on a protected class? If the answer to one of those questions is no, Article 10 does not apply. So let's look quickly at some of those definitions of these four terms we keep hearing. Now, there's a lot of different definitions of harassment. This happens to come from NAR's Code of Conduct and Anti-Harassment Policy. And it reads that harassment includes inappropriate conduct, comment, display, action, or gesture based on the protected classes. And then it gives some examples of what those harassing statements could include. These following come from Merriam-Webster's dictionary: hate speech, speech that's intended to insult, offend, or intimidate because of some trait. An epithet, which is a characterizing word or phrase accompanying or occurring in place of a name of a person or a thing. And then a slur, which is an insulting or disparaging remark or innuendo. And it goes on from there. So these are very specific definitions. And with respect to the code, actionable if it's targeted at a particular class. So putting this all together, I am going to put up one of the more recent examples that I've seen. I actually stole this from an instructor with permission at a class that I was at a couple weeks ago. And I think I'm going to let you all read this. I think that this is very helpful in picking all of this apart. And if you'll read through, this was actually posted by a realtor on Facebook. I don't know if the realtor was in our market or not. I can't remember. I do think I remember it was a realtor who was also an instructor. But this is very strong language. There's a lot of language that could be considered to be hate speech, right? So you look at this and then you have to apply your questions. Could this potentially be considered to be hate speech? Potentially. So then you move to question 2. Is this attacking a protected class? So is a Republican or a political affiliation a protected class? Well, the answer very clearly is no. So this, in this situation, would not be actionable under the code. So moving on to the third change, which is also very significant, was to the definition of the public trust. So as it used to read, the public trust was defined as the demonstrated misappropriation of client or customer funds or property, willful discrimination, or fraud resulting in substantial economic harm. So in situations in the past when realtors were found in violation of the code and their acts amounted to a potential violation of the public trust, realtor associations were obligated to report those findings to the Real Estate Commission for further investigation. So this change in November, with the removal of the words willful and substantial economic harm, expands what we're to provide to the Real Estate Commission. The new definition simply states that the public trust is violated when there is a demonstrated misappropriation of client or customer funds or property, discrimination against the protected classes under the Code of Ethics, or fraud. Now, the removal of willful here does not imply that previously you had to find willful discrimination in order to find someone in violation of Article 10. You can and still can, you could and still can find that person in violation whether the act was willful or not. This is speaking really within the confines of the definition of public trust, which is what triggers these findings to be sent to the commission. So a hearing panel does not need to find willful discrimination anymore, just discrimination, in order to be obligated to send those findings on to the commission. So this is significant. Does this mean that an individual who's found in violation of Article 10 of the code will lose their license? No, not necessarily. Truthfully, we don't know yet how the Real Estate Commission will handle these situations. We've got a lot to learn. There's new information coming out all the time, and it's just going to be a wait and see. And finally, the last change came to the sanctioning guidelines, which were also modified. In the past, NAR will, in general, NAR doesn't recommend specific disciplines for specific offenses, but they do offer key points to consider with respect to discipline. And one of those key points added in November states that in cases where there's a reason to believe a violation of the public trust has occurred, hearing panels should consider these acts to be particularly egregious when determining the appropriate discipline. The NAR guidelines in the past have suggested for due process concerns that hearing panels limit their look back to a period of 3 years. So looking back to see, did this agent violate the Code of Ethics in the past, limited to that 3-year look back period. They use that to determine the severity of the discipline they're going to impose. However, with these changes in November, NAR has now provided that on a first violation of the code with respect to agents who have violated Article 10 or Article 3 as defined under Standard of Practice 311, which was added in 2020 and prohibits realtors from refusing to cooperate with each other based on the 9 protected classes, then the penalty for a first violation could be, amongst several other options, termination of membership for up to 3 years. Again, some very significant changes. There's a lot of information to digest. Hopefully this has helped you somewhat see this from a clearer view. Hopefully it's answered some of the questions you may have had. But what we need to remember is the Code of Ethics is a living and breathing document. These are significant changes. We've had significant changes in the past. We'll have significant changes in the future. And as brokers in charge and realtors, the biggest takeaway is you do have a duty to ensure that your realtor agents know the code and that you know the code. The 2021 Code of Ethics is posted on our website at carolinarealtors.com. It's available for download. NAR.realtor, the National Association website has so much information on this change, materials that you can use. I encourage all of you to download and distribute the Code of Ethics to your agents. And realtors you have a duty to enforce the code, whether it be by filing a complaint or simply addressing unethical behaviors with the offending realtors or the brokers in charge. So that is it for me. I'll stop my screen share.
Michele, fantastic. Never a disappointment. Thank you so much. Question for you on Article 10 specifically. In your opinion, does it apply to personal social media comments from administrative employees who are not realtors but work for your company?
So again, the code can only apply to realtors. And I think that that is something that is going to be interesting as we move down this path. If an administrator is posting on behalf of a realtor or a realtor's firm, I do think that there is a potential that it could reach out to the realtor behind that or the firm behind that.
And also, in your opinion, when you do this presentation, which is fantastic, the examples you use are specifically within the 9 protected classes. It would seem to me that there's just an underlying and understood warning that you don't want to deviate from the specific protected classes when dealing with Article 10. Is that a safe assumption? In other words, when we're leaders and we're explaining it, we got 9 examples that we got to stay within when properly doing this.
Absolutely. Those are the 9 protected classes we're going to look at. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that's out there in social media. I've had, very similar to the example I've shown, I've had complaints come in with the question that this is a violation of the code, and you really do need to tie it back down. Again, it seems broad, but it's really narrowly defined within those protected classes.
All right, just like our drink tickets at our events, you got the 2-question limit there right after your
Right.
presentation, but stick around because we'll have some at the end. And next up is the priceless gem herself, Debbie Way. Good to see you. Good morning. Take it away.
Good morning, David, and thank you. And hello to all of our brokers who are on the meeting today. So I'm going to be speaking about potential fair housing violations in MLS listings. And in describing properties in the MLS, you should, there we go. In describing properties in the MLS, you should avoid indicating a preference of one group over another, using descriptions that relate to race, color, religion, age, familial status, national origin, sexual orientation, or gender identity, which are the protected classes, and any references to racial, ethnic, or religious landmarks nearby. So this tells you what you should avoid doing, but what we should also include is what you should do. And that means that you should make sure that your advertising is compliant with fair housing laws by focusing on the property and the amenities in your rental listing description, or your for sale listing description, and not who you think an ideal renter would be. And I'd like to share a story. When I first started working at Canopy MLS, one of the first issues that I encountered dealing with a potential fair housing violation in the MLS was with regard to the JCC, which stands for the Jewish Community Center. We were getting questions about whether or not it was okay for agents to include statements in the remarks of the listings indicating that the property was close to the JCC or within walking distance of the JCC. It was explained to me that including such statements in the remarks of the listings was considered to be a signal that the listed property would be well suited for a buyer of the Jewish faith. So that seemed to be a potential fair housing violation. The guidelines published by the National Fair Housing Alliance say when advertising housing, it is illegal to specify a preference or limitation to alter the terms and conditions of housing based on someone's membership in any of the protected classes. Agents get pretty upset when we say that you can't say in the remarks of a listing that it's close to the JCC or close to the YMCA. But we have to apply these policies fairly. And even though some may disagree with the policies, we don't have a choice when it comes to abiding by the Fair Housing Act. So what I'd like to also say is that we check for potential fair housing violations to protect the MLS from liability. And it is also to help protect our members from liability. In 2013, an agent was dragged into a fair housing lawsuit over a listing he didn't represent. Realtors can be sued for the content of listings that appear on their websites, regardless of whether they are the author. And that case was settled. And when Canopy MLS checks for potential fair housing violations, We do that, but we do not issue fines. We would like to think that our members would never intentionally violate the Fair Housing Act. So the other issue that I'd like to bring up and address as far as listings in the MLS and the potential for fair housing violations has to do with housing for older persons. And we, Canopy MLS, as well as other MLSs, require the submission of a 55 and older statement of qualification for any listing that is qualified housing for older persons. And what that means is that the community is entirely occupied by persons who are aged, and it's actually kind of being hidden behind my slide right there, age 62 and older, or a development where at least 80% of the units have at least one resident who is 55 or more years of age. And misuse of that 55 and older option in the MLS could actually put the agent in jeopardy of violating federal fair housing regulations. So we require this 55 and older statement of qualification to verify that the community is qualified senior housing. And that statement must come from an officer of the homeowner association, or it could also come from an authorized representative, which would be like a management company who would know if the community meets the housing, the HOP criteria, housing for older persons. So I'd like to share another story that happened, and this is with the listing that was actually in our MLS. I've never heard of a community for 40 years and older or 45 years and older, but we actually came across a situation like that with a neighborhood, and I'm going to give it a fictitious name. It's called Joshua Place. And even though that wasn't the name, Joshua Place had at least 3 potential fair housing violations with the listing that was in the MLS. Number one is that the marquee for the neighborhood that was below the name Joshua Place also had a phrase that said a Christian community. And a photo of the marquee was included in the photos attached to the listing. And this listing came to our attention because of our requirement that we receive this 55 and older statement of qualification, and we hadn't. So we reached out to that agent and asked them for that statement of qualification. In response, what the agent provided us was a copy of the restrictive covenants, which is not what we asked for, but we received them. And so we reviewed those. And what we actually found was that those restrictive covenants had been amended by the HOA, but they had not been recorded to indicate that the community was for anyone over the age of 45. So in my communications with the HOA president to get more information, I discovered that Joshua Place had initially started out as being a 55 and older community, but the HOA had decided to lower the requirement to make an exception for a resident's adult child who was moving into the community. And so we checked with our legal counsel, as we always do, and we came to the conclusion that the property could not be listed in the MLS until the fair housing issues with the restrictive covenants and the marquee were resolved. None of those issues were intended to do harm or to even prohibit non-Christians from moving into the neighborhood, which I learned from talking to the HOA president. But it does just go to show that these types of issues, whether we are intentionally trying to discriminate, which is probably not the case, but these issues do come up from time to time, and agents need to be aware of how they handle them because it does present potential liability. So going back to our 55 and older statement of qualification, we do require this to be submitted to Canopy MLS anytime there's a new listing in a given community, because although that community may qualify as a 55 and older community today, it may not qualify tomorrow, next week, or next month. So we require that statement for each listing, and that gives us the benefit of a good faith defense that if the listing is allowed to state 55 and older, if there's a situation where it is allowed to state 55 and older, even though the community may not meet that definition. And confirming these deed restrictions is not enough. The deed restrictions, as in that example, are often violated, and reliance upon those would not satisfy the good faith reliance standards that we have with that 55 and older statement. So an agent with more than one listing in a given community can provide a single statement that the community is in compliance. But if there's a future listing in that community, we would require an updated certification. So that is our 55 and older statement. The next thing that I just kind of wanted to bring up is about the use of the term master bedroom. And as Michele referred to in her presentation, with all of the unrest that we had last year in 2020, that this term kind of became a hot topic of conversation. It has been reviewed and cleared of discriminatory violations by HUD, but consumer and professional concerns do still remain. The Canopy MLS Board of Directors looked at whether or not they should change how these terms are described in the MLS. And at that point in time, decided to wait until RESO, which stands for the Real Estate Standards Organization, finalized the work that they were doing with regard to what they call the data dictionary. And what that is the sort of the standards and the guidelines that MLSs follow to make sure that we're all speaking the same language when it comes to providing listing data to third-party developers that create apps and websites where agents display listing information. So we wanted to see what changes were going to be made on the national level to those standards. And that was finalized in November by RESO. And what their determination was is that those underlying standardized fields were not going to change. And that was to preserve consistency in the delivery of real estate data. However, if MLSs choose to, we can switch from using the terminology of master bedroom. We could switch to using the terminology of primary bedroom in our display names. So that is something that the Canopy MLS Board of Directors will be revisiting at a future meeting now that RESO has, finalized the work that they were doing with regard to those standardized field names. So that's master bedroom. And then the last thing that I just want to mention before I conclude is a little information about clear cooperation. And so hopefully all of you know about this new policy that was implemented in 2020, May of 2020. It's a policy that requires listings to be submitted to the MLS within 1 business day from being publicly marketed. And the clear cooperation policy actually helps to promote fair housing as well. And it's a policy that lends itself to not excluding any particular person. That clear cooperation policy helps to increase professionalism, and it supports the fact that the MLS exists for cooperation and compensation among brokerages. And if participants are in the MLS, then cooperation, which means sharing listings, should be the first, not the last option to promote a listing. And with that, David, that concludes what I would like to cover as far as MLS compliance with potential fair housing issues.
Ooh, MLS compliance. Fantastic presentation as always. Quick question though, if we can get back to the Joshua Place example, fantastic example, by the way. The adult child that you mentioned, were you aware if there was maybe like a 20% rule of people that were allowed to not be 55 and older? Would that adult child be considered in that category?
My understanding is that they would have been, because if from what I understand is that as long as 80% of the community, if we go back to that definition, 80% of the units have at least one resident who is 55 or more years of age. But the problem was that they had amended their restrictive covenants to something that would not have been compliant with that housing for older persons, those regulations.
All right. And then it's just not going into MLS if it's got if you have that HOA that has some level of a Christian community or something like that, that's we have to, as agents, we have to be able to explain to the folks that it's just a violation of the MLS to have that in there. Is that kind of our course and our charge as agents?
I would say yes, that's correct. I mean, we're not going to allow the MLS to be the platform where discrimination occurs through the listings that we distribute to thousands of websites. But over and above that, agents also have a responsibility not to participate in any type of discrimination, racial or discrimination of any kind for any of those protected classes. So an agent would need to think twice about representing a listing where the potential for that discrimination does occur.
Got it. I'm going to hang on to you with one more. You're my priceless gem. I'm giving you a bonus question here. And this is kind of centered around our everybody's understanding of like internet data exchange or just how things go. If you have a listing that is not yours, but it's showing up on your website, what's your liability if in terms of MLS compliance?
Well, hopefully we're going to catch that before it gets distributed out through IDX. If there is a listing that has a discriminatory remark in it, because we monitor as best as we can for potential fair housing violations. There's no guarantee that we're going to catch everything. But from what we saw, and that case was actually in Florida, from what we saw is that there is potential liability for agents with their websites if something like that were to slip through and be displayed on a website. And not only for agents, MLSs can also be held liable. So, and we've seen that happen as well. So that's, we monitor for that for ourselves and also to help protect our members.
So we could potentially revert back to the MLS if something comes through IDX.
I'm not sure I understand that question.
Yeah, it's okay. You did a bonus question for us. God bless you. Alexia, are you still here with us?
Yes, I am.
I wanted to tell you that we've got a collection of us. Alexia, Michele, and Debbie have been motoring through a ton of the questions that have been put in the chat, and I am extremely appreciative, as I know all the leaders here in our firms are as well. And we have a couple of rolling in as well, but there's one that just caught me. And I gotta ask. So it's centered around, hey, what's worse, actually having some racist tendency or knowing you have racist tendencies? So how can you get over that obstacle when you look at Fairhaven and you're intimidated by it because you're afraid of what you might find out about yourself?
This is something we cover in implicit bias training. I have a little visitor here. Just a minute, honey. It can be scary to confront these issues. It's uncomfortable, and we're taught to avoid it and not talk about it. But we need to take a look at ourselves to make sure that we are offering the same treatment to everybody else. And so our implicit bias training, and we have the video up on our site, I posted a link, can help you begin to sort of work through some of that discomfort. That is something that we need to do to make sure that we're providing the same service to everybody.
Awesome. And a big shout out to your helper there, your personal assistant. We appreciate all the thoughts and messages she's sending you to make sure you get to us. Thank you again. I wonder, there's some folks, I think that some questions coming in about, they want to make sure they're compliant with MLS. And what is an agent's role in monitoring versus the MLS's role? If you see something, if an agent or a broker or firm or one of our leaders here on the call sees something that's a head scratcher, they have a concern, what's next? What do they need to do, Debbie Way?
I would just encourage you to reach out to us at compliance@carolinahome.com. That's our website, our email address, or give us a call to MLS support. Ask us the question. I may not know all of the answers, but I have a great team behind me who can help me just, decipher whether something would be considered a potential fair housing violation. But it goes back to that one phrase that you can find on that National Fair Housing Alliance website that I referred to, which is describe the property, not who's best to live there. So one of the things that comes up a lot is the word children. We see the use of the word children a lot in the listings, and somebody, may say something like great backyard for children, right? And while that doesn't seem like a potential fair housing violation, because the protected class, my understanding is families with children. So if you're being inclusive of that, that may not be a problem, but you also have to look at it from a different perspective, which is, are we sending a signal that we don't want singles or senior citizens or people who aren't families and who don't have children? So maybe a better way to describe that would be great flat backyard for playtime, parties or recreation. Describe the property, not who's best to live there.
So we talked about at the beginning, or at least I began the comments about, hey, we only got leaders of firms here because we wanted this to be a safe environment for questions to come out, and we have done that, which is great. If there is a problem, I think sometimes people they're afraid that if they expose it or report it, somehow it could be detrimental to them. They could get fined. There could be a level of punishment. Can you speak to how the safe space we've created here kind of extends to help lines and help desks whenever you see things that could potentially be problematic, but you're afraid it could have some liability concerns on your end?
All right, well, I'll start. I don't know if Alexia or Michele want to jump in too, but I don't think you have to be afraid to bring it up to MLS support or our compliance staff. Number one, like what I said, is we don't issue a fine if there's a listing where we believe there may be a potential fair housing violation. We send those out as courtesy notices. If it's something that, there's the potential, but, it's not a definite yes or no, we give the agent the opportunity to go rephrase, maybe come up with a better way of saying, what they could say in the remarks of that listing. If our legal counsel tells us they're fairly sure it would be a potential violation, then we're just going to take it right out of the listing. And we will still notify the agent with a courtesy notice, hey, we did this, but so you might want to go back and double check your listing, make sure it's worded the way that you want it to be worded. But, we have taken out this particular phrase that was used, which, like I said, is probably completely unintentional. But there's enough liability there or enough concern there that we felt like we would have to take it out.
I saw a question and I've lost it, but which means somebody maybe answers, but I do want to ask it. It's Valentine's Day on Sunday, and a lot of people who are in love write each other love letters. And love letters is something that has now been entered into the home buying process. Thoughts from all three of you on love letters? And I'll tell you, I'm going to send a love letter to my wife right now, who's hung over on the couch to make me some more coffee. But when you're doing a love letter in a real estate transaction, is that a good thing, a bad thing, or it's all in how you do it? All three of you kind of chime in on what your thoughts are there.
Who wants to go first? Michele?
Alexa, I think you should go first. No, I will start, and then I know Alexa's got a lot more in her toolkit to address this, but we are going to be addressing this more very soon, because there's a lot of buyers who want to send those letters. The market is hot, inventory is low, so they want to get in front of the seller and say, here's why you should pick me. And it is a dangerous thing, and NAR has recommendations to avoid at all costs. buyer love letters going to the seller for the potential fair housing issues that it could create. Yeah, if your buyer is pushing for a buyer love letter, best recommendation is to first try to steer them away from that. And then if they insist upon it, remove yourself from that part of the transaction. Don't be the one that delivers that. Don't get involved. Don't read it. Don't look at it. So Alexa, you want to go ahead and add to that?
Sure. So love letters aren't illegal. They aren't prohibited, but they do present risks, because if a buyer is revealing personal characteristics about themselves, if they're saying, you know, I could see our family celebrating Christmas around the fireplace, there is a risk that that seller might then choose their offer based on those personal characteristics and not because they've made the best offer. And in that case, that seller is opening themselves up to liability. And so you might get pulled in as a witness. So our recommendation is, you know, first of all, if your client wants to do it, educate them, tell them about the risks. You know, you may want to advise them to seek the advice of a lawyer. And, you know, we say, don't get involved. If they want to do it, you're not going to help them write it. You're not going to deliver it. And also, if they insist on doing it anyway, you may want to document that and include it in your documentation. I also posted a link in the chat box of something we just published on it.
That's great advice, and I want to throw this to Debbie Way, but make sure she kind of gives me an answer in a perspective that I'm curious about, and that is, we've gotten great advice from Michele and Alexia, like don't do it, but like I tell my kids not to do, it's things once they do it, now what? So if you're a listing agent or someone that is you're getting a property ready, maybe you haven't executed the agreement, and all of a sudden you get this love letter. You know, is it a violation of clear cooperation? I mean, where are you at, and what do you do when, you know, the cat's out of the bag and people have not followed the sound advice just given to us by Michele and Alexia?
Okay, well, I can speak to the clear cooperation aspect of it. So you're getting ready to list a property. You haven't gotten your listing agreement signed yet. The seller gets a love letter from a prospective buyer that they want to purchase the property. That doesn't necessarily trigger clear cooperation. It's when you are publicly marketing a listing, that would be the trigger. But then also, if that buyer is being represented by a broker from a different firm, and anytime there's cooperation between the listing brokerage and a cooperating brokerage, that would also trigger the clear cooperation. So once you get that signed listing agreement, then you're going to be required to submit that listing to the MLS within 1 business day. And then I will leave it to Michele to answer the question about the buyer love letter.
And I guess, Michele, you kind of also help us explain to the buyer what the risk is. You know, if we have a buyer in front of us, say, hey, here's the risk for writing that love letter, and in your opinion, what are some of the tools we can use to advise them to the best of our ability?
Well, from the buyer's perspective, it's hard to say that they're going to care what the risks are. They are presenting a picture of themselves. I mean, they want the house, so they're going to write that letter. From a fair housing perspective, I mean, you're putting your seller at risk, right? You're putting the seller at risk of discriminating against someone who might have a better offer, you know, Alexa, I'm going to ask you to help me out a little bit, since you dive into this a little bit more every day than I do. But you know, I don't think you're going to ultimately prevent buyers who are dead set on submitting that buyer love letter. But
unless, you know, sorry, my head keeps disappearing. I'm like moving around to make my head show up. If it can be shown that the buyer was on purpose trying to suggest, hey, you should choose me because I'm the same race as you, or I'm the same religion as you, then it's possible that the buyer could be implicated if they are purposefully doing that.
And agent, David, I would just kind of add on, I think, which Michele alluded to, that, putting your seller's best interest first also means, putting that listing in the MLS, giving it marketing exposure to the greatest pool of buyers that's out there. That's what's going to create the highest price. And it's also consistent with, the ideals behind fair housing, which is making that property available to all of that, extensive pool of buyers.
Got it. Ladies, I always, we've got 5 minutes to go, and I want to give each and every one of you an opportunity to give us one last word. I'll start with Michele, go with Debbie, and then our guest, Alexia. So any last words from our titans of trust and wonderful minds here?
Love these titles you're giving us today. Just my final words, just related to my presentation and knowing the code. I get a lot of calls. I get a lot of people questioning ethical behaviors. A lot of agents, as you probably know, don't follow through with doing anything about that. But it does make me feel like agents are actually starting to read the code a little bit more. And I just implore all of you to distribute it at your sales meetings. I am happy to come and talk virtually now at your sales meetings about the code on any topic, any article. So read the code, know the code, set yourself apart.
Okay, thank you. And so my final comments would be, describe the property, not who's best to live there. When you're listing properties in the MLS, if you're listing a property in a 55 and older neighborhood, send us that statement of qualification. And then finally, adhere to those clear cooperation guidelines so that you are providing that maximum exposure of the property to the greatest pool of buyers.
Well, I guess I'd like to say that NAR has come a long way. In the 1920s, our code of ethics advised members to not introduce new racial groups to a new neighborhood. In 1968, NAR opposed passage of the Fair Housing Act. We've come a long way. We're now investing a lot more staff and resources into fair housing, and we're going to be providing a lot of that to you. And so we're here for you, and reach out to us.
Ladies, thank you once again, and thanks again to our leaders out there. I salute each and every one of you for all being here this morning. And as again, these moments of education can easily save us all years of heartache. So to Debbie Way, Vice President of MLS Administration, Michele McCaskill, Vice President of Risk Management and Assistant General Counsel, and to Alexia Smokler, NAR Senior Policy Representative for Fair Housing. Couldn't have asked for three more robustly and lovely minds to talk to us today and educate us. We are all the better for it. So folks out there, if you missed something, if you missed anything and you want to hear it again, this event was recorded and we've got it put up on www.carolinarealtors.com. I said that in past tense. It's actually going to be put up on www.carolinarealtors.com, but it's always good to plug that website once again. And as a reminder, these slide decks will be put up as well. And I will also make sure you have that link to go to Fairhaven. And don't worry about how long it takes you to get things done. Just get in there and get things done. So again, I salute each and every one of you for being here. Thank you very much. Have a great rest of your Friday.